Yeah.
Okay, this is what I want to ask you about, because I've heard you talk about this recently, and we don't. On May 26, 1968, your father made a statement that we must defend Israel against aggression from wherever source. Our obligation to Israel, unlike our obligation towards other countries, are clear and imperative. The U.S. should without delay sell Israel 50 Phantom jets. Okay. A day later, Kennedy's strong plea for the defense of Israel appeared in the Pasadena Independent. The article enraged a Palestinian named Sirhan Sirhan. He wrote in his diary, Robert F. Kennedy must be assassinated before June 5th, which was the first anniversary of the 67 Six-Day War in Israel. The Pasadena Independent was in his pocket when he committed the act. He was killed because of his support for Israel, says Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. That's not the case? That's not the truth?
Well, he was, Sirhan was involved in the murder of my father, but he did not fire the shots that killed my father. Oh, and
but didn't he want to, but according to this, is that wrong that he read this story, was enraged as a Palestinian? I mean, it's the idea that the article was in his pocket when he committed the act, is that wrong?
That could be right, and I don't speculate as to what happened. All I say is that Sirhan himself could not have killed my father. And that's what Thomas Noguchi, who is the coroner, and by the way, my entire life, I believe that my uncle was killed not by a conspiracy, by a group of people. And I had doubts about that from when I was little, because when the day that we were waking my uncle in the East Room of the White House, and I was standing in the foyer of the White House with my Aunt Jackie and with my dad and my mother. And Lyndon Johnson came in and told us that Jack Ruby had killed Lee Harvey Oswald. For the people who are young people, Lee Harvey Oswald was the person who was charged with arrested for killing my uncle. And a day later, he was killed in the jailhouse by a guy, who came in.
A nightclub owner.
What?
A nightclub owner.
A nightclub owner
named Jack
who was,
Ruby.
deeply involved with the mob.
Not the worst nightclub owner I ever worked for, but
yeah,
an asshole nonetheless.
Anyway, and I had said to my dad and my mother at that time, why did he do it? Did he love our family? Because even as a little kid, it didn't make any sense to me. Why would you go do that in public when when you're putting your own life at stake? And so that story never made any sense. And then, when I was older, I researched it. Somebody gave me a book called The Unspeakable, and I read it, and the whole story that made sense. But I still believe that my father had been killed by Sirhan. Sirhan confessed to the murder. He pled guilty. And, his story is that he has no memory of it. And he's stuck with that story for 60 years. So, but Paul, there was a man standing, one of my father's best friends, was standing beside him when my father was shot. And his name is Paul Schrade. He was the deputy director of the United Auto Workers, and he's the guy who recruited Cesar Chavez to the labor movement, to the United Farm Workers, and then introduced my father to Cesar Chavez, which was one of the most important relationships that my father had. And the first shot that Sirhan fired hit Paul in the head. Paul survived, and he just died less than a year ago. And he spent the last 20 years of his life trying to get Sirhan out of jail, because he did not believe that Sirhan killed my father. And I just sort of dismissed what, over years, I'd hear that Al Lowenstein, who you may remember, was trying to get my father, Sirhan out, because Al Lowenstein was a congressman, a great friend of my father's, started the Dump Johnson movement. He was later assassinated himself. He became a congressman, was killed. But he fought for many years to get Sirhan out and get the the case reopened because he did not believe that my father was killed by Sirhan, but I never looked into any details. I just assumed there were 77 eyewitnesses. Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy.
Right.
And then Paul Schrade made me come over to his house one day and read the autopsy report. How did he make me? He told me, you have to do this. And because he was such a close friend of my father's and because he himself had been shot, I felt like I couldn't say no to him. And when I sat down and read the autopsy report, it became clear to me, as it would to anybody who read that report, that Sirhan could not have killed my father, which is what Thomas Noguchi, the coroner, the most important coroner probably in American history, concluded also and said in his autobiography. And here's what happened, the short story. Sirhan fired 2 shots at my father. He was 5 feet away. There was, as I said, there was absolute mayhem in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. My father just won the primary. He said from the stage, and now it's on to Chicago, which was where the convention was. Then he walks off the stage and he went into a route that was not expected. He was led into a route through the kitchen, which he was not supposed to go to. And waiting in the kitchen in an ambush was Sirhan standing in front of a steam table. And as my father approached the steam table, Sirhan fired at him 2 shots. One of those hit Paul Schrade. The other one went past my father's ear and hit a door jamb behind my father, a wooden door jamb from which it was later removed by the LAPD. Sirhan was then grabbed by 6 men in a dog pile, and he was backed onto the steam table. And his hand, Rayford Johnson, who was a great friend of mine, one of my father's close friends, he was the decathlon gold medal winner in 1960. He was one of the people who grabbed it, and he was the one who actually grabbed his hand. And he said that Sirhan, who's a tiny little man, I've been to meet him and visit him in prison. He said the tiniest little guy. But Rayford said he had superhuman strength, and he could not get that gun out of his hand. And Sirhan now was pointing the gun away from my father and fired 6 more shots. So there's 8 shots in the barrel. He fired 6 in the other direction, the opposite direction from where my father was. All of those shots hit people. So we know who they hit. We know what happened to all of those bullets. One person got shot twice, once through his once through his clothing. And my father was shot 4 times from behind. And
so it's the same scenario as Oswald.
Well, let me just finish.
A patsy and a real shooter.
Right. So he was a distractor. And the real shooter was behind my father. He was a man called Eugene Thanes Cesar, who was a security guard who worked for Lockheed. He was a CIA operative. He was a vocal racist who hated the Kennedys. And he had been the one who led my father through the kitchen toward the ambush. He was holding my father's arm. He drew his gun.
Right.
And my father was shot 4 times from behind. One of the shots passed through the shoulder pad of his, harmlessly through the shoulder pad of his coat. The other 2 were into his back, and then one behind his ear, which was the fatal shot. And all of the shots had an uphill trajectory. And all of them, and this is what the autopsy found, were contact shots. So the barrel of the gun was touching my father's body or his clothing, and they left the discharge left carbon tattoos or less than an inch from his skin. So they left carbon tattoos on his flesh. And the autopsy was an exquisite autopsy. It's called the perfect autopsy. Thomas Noguchi, who knew what had happened in President Kennedy's autopsy, which was, loaded with scandal, did not want the same thing to happen in LA. And he said, we're not going to do Dallas again. So he flew in the top coroners from all of the armed services, the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, to observe what he was doing. And his autopsy is called the perfect autopsy in the medical literature. And, he concluded that the shots had come from behind. And there were 77 eyewitnesses who saw that Sirhan was never behind my father. He was always in front of him, always about 5 feet away. And all the shots that killed him. Now,
It seems so open.
he fell, and as my father fell, he must have known he was being shot from behind, because he turned around and grabbed off Cesar's clip-on tie. And you can see pictures of him lying on the floor, and he's actually lying on top of Cesar with the clip-on tie in his hand. And there's pictures of Cesar without his tie on. Cesar pushed my father off him and stood up. He was knocked down when my father fell onto him. He stood up and was seen with his gun. The police did not confiscate the gun that night, and they asked him what he was doing, and he said he drew the gun to shoot at Sirhan. And, and then that's the beginning of the story. And then Cesar made a series of changing, deceptive, lying statements after that in the different times he was questioned over many, many years. I cannot tell you what happened. I can speculate about it, but I can tell you that I cannot see any way that anybody can read that autopsy report and believe that Sirhan killed my father. And that's, my point is that it ought to be investigated. There was no trial. It was a show trial. So, an attorney whose name was Grant, I forget what his last name, he appeared, nobody knows how, and became Sirhan's attorney. Who was he? He was the attorney for Johnny Roselli, the mobster who was implicated in John Kennedy's assassination in Dallas 5 years earlier, and was later chopped up and put in a barrel when the assassination committee summons him to testify. When the church committee summons him in Biscayne Bay, Miami, his body was found in Miami. He disappeared the day he was supposed to testify in front of the church committee on the assassinations. And he was involved at that time in the Friars Club scandal. So you know what the Friars Club scandal is?
No.
You know what the Friars Club is?
I certainly do that.
Right, okay. And you've probably been there and followed
yes.
the roasts and stuff.
Yes.
So that statute, was run by, Roselli was one of the people who was running it, and the Mickey Cohen, the LA mobster.
Yeah.
And they were doing card games there. So they had poker games. It was a place where the famous people,
Sure. It's a club.
Comedians went to play
Yeah, it's a
poker.
club.
And they had installed cameras in the ceiling so they could read everybody's hands.
Oh.
And they got busted for it. And that trial was going on when my father was killed. And the attorney for Roselli at that time was the guy who weirdly showed up, nobody can explain why, and became Sirhan's attorney. And he was under federal investigation because somehow Roselli had been able to obtain the grand jury testimony, which is that's a jailhouse sentence. You cannot, that is like stealing the U.S. mail. If you steal grand jury testimony, it's such a serious crime that you're gonna go to jail. The lawyer got blamed for it. So he himself was under federal investigation and was about to get disbarred. And he then ended up representing Sirhan. He was involved in concealing evidence. He was the one who told Sirhan to plead guilty, and he blocked the ballistics evidence. The bullets that killed my father were different than the bullets came from a different gun than the bullets that killed other people or shot other people. Nobody else died. Anyway, there's a lot of questions that should be answered, and if you look at the evidence, it doesn't make any sense. And then the LAPD.
I will never trust the guy in a bow tie again.
It wasn't a clip-on tie.
But so it just must be so frustrating that this seems like so clear-cut, but like the whole world thinks the reverse. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
it's
got
a
to be
conspiracy theory.
Yeah. Well, that's yeah. But it's not. I mean, you convinced me. Anyway, I'm going to let you go. I hope this does well for your campaign. I really think you in the mix is a great thing, because certainly somebody's got to keep them honest. And the one thing I can count on you, like, will we ever agree eye to eye on everything? No. Who do you agree eye to eye with? It? Nobody. And you shouldn't. We're humans. But, somebody has to keep them honest. And the one thing I think I can count on you is you're not a guy who's going to shake the Etch-a-Sketch. Remember Mitt Romney? You're not going to attack. I don't think. Or maybe you will. I don't know. Maybe, if you get close, it's going to be very tempting to, go more to the center and disavow. Nothing in your past tells me you'll do that. You are a guy, you love me or hate me, disown me. I am sticking to what I know, or what I believe I know. That I think I can count on. I think that's gonna count a lot. Counts a lot with me. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for watching the clip. Hit the subscribe button now so you never miss out on our Club Random content that's posted daily.